Well, welcome to session 2, and we're going to look at the Gospel of John. And the reason I do this is actually rather strange, since John's Gospel is one of the last things written in our Bible, in our New Testament, and I'm going to deal with it almost first. This is our second session. But if you remember from our first session, when I dealt with the intertestamental period, I suggested to you that the Old Testament ends up in the air. There's no conclusion. And so there were many competing stories for how the Old Testament was going to be finished, how it was going to be brought to completion at the time of Jesus. There was the story told by the Pharisees, another one by the Sadducees, by the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scroll community, Sicarii, etc. And I suggested to you that Christianity comes along and puts its understanding of how the Old Testament is brought to completion out there in the marketplace of stories. Now, the reason I go to John is because of its late date, probably written around 90-95 AD. In other words, it's the most, it's the writing that has had the most time to reflect on Christianity, on the gospel, on the development of the church. It's the writing that can best, maybe not best, but certainly has had the most time to reflect on and refine, hone its stories in the marketplace of stories so that it can meet the needs of the people to whom John is writing. John's a very helpful author. He actually tells us what he's trying to do and how he hopes to achieve that. In John chapter 20 and verse 30 and 31, we read these words: Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, John's Gospel. But these miraculous signs are written in this book, John's Gospel, in order that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. John tells us some important things here. Jesus did many other miraculous signs, says John. First thing to notice, I'm reading from New International Version here, which adds the words miraculous signs. John actually doesn't use the word miracle anywhere in his gospel. Yet, if you raise Lazarus from the dead, if you give sight to a man born blind, if you feed 5,000, if you walk on water, surely they're miracles. John prefers the word sign because he tells us many other signs, many other miracles Jesus did in the presence of his disciples that are not recorded in this book. John tells you, in fact, if you go to the last verse of John's Gospel, 21:25, he says, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them had to be written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would have to be written. So John says Jesus did a world full of things that obviously I can't write a book about, certainly not the size of John's Gospel. What I've got to do is select from that, and I'm going to select from all the miracles, for example, the ones that I most think are like a signpost to Jesus being Messiah, Christ, the Son of God, so that believing that Jesus is Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God, you may have life in his name. So John tells us then that he's using a selection criteria. Of all the things that Jesus did and said, John says, I'm going to select a few. Many commentators of old have said that there were 7 miracles that John chose of all the miracles Jesus did, and you can structure John's Gospel on those 7 signs of John's Gospel, to quote one of the great commentators of old, Tenney. I'm not sure that's correct, but you can see the concept that they have. So John says, many things did Jesus do, John 21:25, a whole world full of them. I'm going to select some, John 20:30, and I'm going to write them down. The ones I best think are a signpost to Jesus being Messiah, Son of God, and I'm going to write them down so that you may believe. And here, if you've got a New International Version, just check. You'll find a little note, either down the bottom of your page or in the margin, whatever it is, that some manuscripts read, continue to believe. If John wrote, these things are written down that you may believe, then he's obviously writing to people who are not Christians to help them and to persuade them to become Christians. If the other option is correct, these things are written in order that you may continue to believe, then John is writing to Christians Something has caused them to doubt whether Jesus is Messiah, Son of God. And John is writing as good pastor to get them to continue to believe. Now, this is not the place, and we don't have the time, and probably I don't have the ability and patience to be able to prove to you, but the translation that you may continue to believe is, my understanding, the correct one. In other words, John is writing to Christians to get them to continue to believe that Jesus is Messiah, Son of God, and that only believing that will they have life, relationship with God in the name of Jesus. Now, if that's the right reading, which I'm persuaded it is, and we do a whole course called John's Writings, spend 15 weeks, and probably a whole 3 hours just proving that continue to believe is the right reading, then you can propose that something or someone has caused the people to whom John is writing to be disturbed whether Jesus is Messiah or not. Now, the only people who are going to argue about Messiah are Jews and Christians. And so we popularly propose that John is writing 95 AD to Christians who've recently been kicked out of the synagogue, which was the usual place to meet of Christians and Jews and so on. And they've been kicked out of the synagogue in Ephesus, and their former associates in the synagogue, Jews, unbelieving Jews, have not only kicked them out, but they're now accusing these Christians of following the wrong Messiah. And obviously, if you, in a worldview, both Christian and Jewish, if you follow the wrong Messiah, the outcomes of that are catastrophic in this life, but even more so, of course, in the next life. And so some of the Christians, disturbed by their former friends in the synagogue, are now wondering whether they really are indeed following the right Messiah. John can't be there in person. Maybe he's off on Patmos writing Revelation. And so he writes the Gospel of John to these Christians, recently kicked out of the synagogue in Ephesus, disturbed whether Jesus is true Messiah and are they going to be facing an eternal damnation for following the wrong Messiah. And John, as good pastor, writes by taking all that Jesus did and said, 21-25, some things to write in this book, John 20 verse 30, so that they will continue to believe, John 20:31, that Jesus is Messiah, Son of God. And only by believing that will they have life in his name. So John tells us, what's he trying to achieve? Get his readers to continue to believe that Jesus is the promised Messiah. Remember the last lesson, intertestamental period. Who would the Messiah be like? Judas Maccabeus. Jesus wasn't like that. That may be one of the attacks of these non-believing Jews in Ephesus synagogue who've recently kicked the Christians out, that he doesn't fit the popular expectation of Messiah. So John writes then that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So John tells us what he's trying to achieve, that you may continue to believe. How he's trying to achieve it. Selection. Put in those miracles that he most thinks point as a signpost to Jesus being Messiah, Son of God. That means then that when we come to the miracles in John's Gospel, we need to ask the first question, how is this proving? What's its signpost value in pointing to Jesus, Messiah, Son of God? How does this miracle prove that, firstly and foremostly? If I wanted to read the Gospels, because I'm a Pentecostal and believe that God has given us the same Holy Spirit that he gave Jesus, so we can perform same miracles that Jesus does, then I'd need to go to Luke's Gospel, since that's his agenda. But John, that's not the way we are to handle the miracles in John's Gospel. John says, I'm not telling you these things so you can pray for the Holy Spirit to duplicate them. Go to Luke to do that. Go to Matthew and Mark. John says, I'm recording these miracles to point to Jesus being Messiah. So the first thing I need to do when I come across a miracle in John's Gospel is to ask, how does this miracle prove that Jesus is indeed the Messiah of God, Son of God, that I believe in to have life in his name? Come with me then to the first miracle. In John chapter 2, verse 1 to 11, we have the first miracle, the first sign. We know that because John tells us in 2:11, this first sign, this first miraculous sign, NIV additional word, this first sign did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, and they believed. So we know that turning water into wine is one of the signs, one of the miracles that John thought were going to be signposts to Jesus being Messiah. John thought this was a good one to put into his book to help the Christians challenged by their former associates in the synagogue, recently kicked them out and challenged them as to whether Jesus is truly Messiah. John thinks this sign is a good one to not only choose but to put first, and hence we need to ask his interpretive question: how does this prove Jesus is Messiah? Well, firstly, I guess we can say is that this isn't such a spectacular miracle. Better miracles were done before this one and after. Turning water into wine isn't such a great miracle. But obviously John thinks it is, and who would I want to argue with him? The trick, I guess, is to have a look at what John has told us about this miracle. And the first thing to notice is the kind of water that Jesus turns into wine. It's not just ordinary water. It is Jewish purification water. It's the water you wash in to be acceptable before God. It's that which makes you ceremonially clean, that which makes you be able to stand in the presence of God. That's the kind of water that Jesus turns into wine. Secondly, notice the amount. This being alcoholic or otherwise, if you drink this amount of liquid, you're going to be in trouble. There's a huge amount of water. Thirdly, it all occurs at a marriage feast. Now I need to put that together, and with John, who's reflecting 60 years after the events to meet the needs of a bunch of Christians recently kicked out of the synagogue, being challenged by Jewish understandings, what their understanding is and why this particular miracle might be significant. In a Jewish understanding of time, they break time into two periods: this present evil age and the age to come. The thing that divides this present evil age from the age to come is the coming of Messiah. This present evil age is where God's people are oppressed. Jews in Israel don't own the land. Romans, they have to pay tax to. It's desecrated and unclean because of Gentile feet who shed blood. The temple's there, but it's built by someone not a Jew. It is staffed by those who are not from the family lineage of Aaron. God's people are oppressed. God's name is blasphemed in this present evil age. It's the age of Satan, the age of sin. It's the age of oppression. It's this present evil age. But Jews could hold on to, we're the people of God, even though we don't have any of the marks of the people of God. The land's not ours. The temple's defiled. The priesthood is corrupt. But there's coming a day when all of this will be changed. A great reversal will happen. When Messiah comes, he will put everything right. We will have a restored temple with the right priesthood. We will worship God. His name will be honoured. His people vindicated in the age to come. This viewpoint, this worldview, this symbolic universe, all of those phrases mean the same thing, was the way that the people of God could hold on to the fact that they're the people of God, yet everything looked as if they weren't. It became so popular that during that intertestamental period that we spoke about in the first session, they invented lots of different synonymous ways of talking about this. This present evil age, the age of sin. This present evil age, the age of the devil. The age of sickness, the age of sin, the age of unrighteousness, the age of darkness, the demonic. The age to come is the age of Messiah, the age of righteousness, the age of glory. All of these different ways to define this eschatology. Eschatology, from the Greek word eschatos, last, and logos, word. Eschatology is words about last things. And so this eschatology, this view of time, became so important to the Jews with these lots of different synonyms, parallel terms. One of the most popular that developed during the intertestamental period, that flows on into the New Testament period, is that this present evil age was called the age of water. Yeah, you guessed it. The age to come was called the age of wine. Now you pause and you think, why? But when you realise that the first century Jews are an agrarian culture, they're a subsistence farming people, and when you realise that they have a theistic worldview, they believe in God, you realise then that they would think, unlike me, who's so secular and so ungodly sometimes, when I look out the window and say, wow, the sun's shining. The Jews don't do that. They go, God has given us the sun. I'm so secular, I look out and I go, it's raining. But they don't. They say, God has sent the rain. So they understand when their crops grow that they need to live, they're subsistence farmers, their food that they need to live, that it's the product of the sun and the rain, the former and latter rains. And both the sun and the rain are the product of God's goodness and grace to them. So they understand that when the crops grow, sun and rain from God, we must be blessed of God. Now, obviously then, when it doesn't rain, they know that they're under the judgment of God. Think of your Old Testament. Elijah rocks up one day and he says to Ahab, at my word it will not rain for the space of 3 years. Why? Because Israel is worshipping Baal. And so the judgment of God is visible, is evident when God withholds the rains. You remember at the great confrontation with Elijah up on the mountain, the prophets of Baal put to death, and the size of a cloud of a man's hand, and Elijah running before the chariots as it begins to pour with rain. Why? Because Israel has repented. And 7,000 have not bowed the knee to Baal along with Elijah, but now Israel turns and God brings the rain back to show that he is forgiven. So it's no wonder then that this present evil age, the age of water, the age of wine. Why? Because in the ideal world, when Messiah comes, when he puts everything right, when we're back in relationship with God, when we don't have any enemies to come, even when our crops grow, the Romans come and pinch them, when our enemies are defeated, when God gives us the sun and the rain, the former and latter rain, and the crops grow, amongst those crops will be the wine. Now the wine was so important because in the first century, no purification, plants like we have, no turn on your tap and you get nice clean water. Water can be deadly, and one of the ways that you purified the water was a mixture of 1 part to 6 parts water with wine, which in its alcohol content would purify the water. Now you can imagine then if you had all your wine taken, it wasn't simply a matter of feeling good, it was a matter of life and death. And so the age to come was pictured as the wine flowing up to the horse's bridle. When Melchizedek comes, one of the intertestamental book tells us Melchizedek is their name for Messiah. When Melchizedek comes, the wine will flow freely up to the horse's bridle, being obviously a picturesque of restoration back to God, the rain's coming, the sun shining, everything being harmonious, no enemy to come and pinch our crops. There'll be abundance of grapes. There will be the wine flowing freely. That's a vivid way to describe to an agrarian culture that they're back in relationship with God. Now what John does is he chooses this miracle, 60 years after the event, to reflect on who Jesus is and what he has done for us. Puts it first in his gospel to inform us about where the gospel's going as a signpost to proving Jesus is Messiah. And we go, reality check, John. You can say all you like that Jesus is the true Messiah and taken us from the age of water to the age of wine, but when we grow our crops, the Romans still come and pinch them if the high priest and his Sadducean mates haven't done it. Take a reality check, John. But again, we have to go back to the mind view, the world view of the thinking of the Jew in the first century. It was fantastic to have beautiful crops. It was fantastic to have great houses to live in. It was fantastic to have no enemies. All of that was great. But even though you would want all that, that was really, if you like, the icing on the cake. It was the tip of the iceberg. The bigger issue for them was right relationship with God. What they longed for, what they wanted more than anything else was re-establishment of right relationship with God. They believed, get that in place, all the other things, the little tip of the iceberg, the no enemies, the crops that grow, the wine that flows, they're all great, but they come after right relationship with God. Now what John's story, of course, is that in Jesus, the true Messiah, right relationship with God has been restored. Now, it's true, we still have enemies, we still don't have wine flowing freely, we still are in trouble around us. But as Christians, we believe Jesus has re-established relationship with God, and those other things will follow. Now take some of John's other writings, for example, the book of Revelation, and you'll see that John deals with the tip of the iceberg in the book of Revelation at the end of time. But the whole emphasis is that right relationship with God is being restored. Now what John wants to tell these people then, mid-90s AD, recently kicked out of the synagogue synagogue in Ephesus, challenged by their former associates that they're following the wrong Messiah. John says of all the things that Jesus did, I'm going to choose these. And he chooses the water into wine first and puts it first in his gospel to set up the whole story of Christianity in 60 years of reflection. That in Jesus, the true Messiah, we pass from the age of water, of broken relationship with God, to the age of wine, of restored relationship that will end in a harmonious universe that's secured by Jesus Messiah on the cross for us. That's the way that John's gospel begins. If we come down a little bit in chapter 2 to verses 13 to 25, we get the second sign. Jesus, you remember, goes into the temple courts and finds the money changers and the sellers of animals and gets really angry, and he drives them out. In response to that, of course, the authorities are not sort of really happy about that, and so they challenge Jesus. The Jews said to Jesus, the Jewish authorities, what sign, notice the important word, what sign can you show us that you have the authority to do these things? Jesus responded, I will show you, I will give you this sign. Destroy this temple and in 3 days raise it up again. I can imagine they all burst into laughter and rolled on the floor at this time because their response is, that's stupid and ridiculous. This temple has been 46 years in the building and is still nowhere near finished. It took another 30 years before it was finished, and then God, in his sense of humour, sent Titus the Roman along and destroyed the place. But 46 years to this point it had been in the process, and Jesus reckons, I can tear it down and in 3 days rebuild it. Now John adds a little a note as an editor. If you've got a modern Bible, you'll see brackets around it, and it says, after the resurrection, the disciples remembered this statement, tear down this temple in 3 days, rebuild it, and they believed because they understood that he meant his body. 60 years after the event, Jewish way of thinking, temple, place where you meet with God, the presence of God with his people. In the new story that Christianity offers into the marketplace of stories about how the Old Testament comes to completion, the Christian version, the Christian truth. I say story, but I don't mean by that fairy story. I mean the way of telling things the way they are so that you can memorize, you can remember them easily and fit it into your lifestyle. The Christian story is that in the coming of Jesus, we have the true coming of Messiah. He's brought us from the age of water to the age of wine. We're in restored relationship with God. But now in this new age of Messiah, in the Messianic age, we find God's presence no longer in a bricks and mortar temple on a mount in Jerusalem, but we find the presence of God in the resurrected Christ. The place you go to worship God is no longer a temple mount, but it's rather in the resurrected Christ. In John's Gospel, John marries together the Spirit and Jesus so closely that we have what we call a Spirit Christology. In John's thinking, where you've got Jesus, you've got the Spirit. Where you've got the Spirit, you've got Jesus. So the resurrected Christ is present by his Spirit. So if we can go through the rest of John's Gospel, what we'd say is the new temple in the new age of Messiah, the new place where you find God's presence, the new place you come to worship him, is where the Spirit is, where the resurrected Christ is, where the Spirit is. If you flip across to chapter 4, remember, when Jesus meets the woman at the well, she stumbles through the conversation to the realisation that you are a prophet. You can answer an age-old question for me then. My leaders tell me I've got to worship God in this mountain, Mount Gerizim in Samaria. But you Jews say you must worship God in Jerusalem. Who's right? And I love Jesus. Is it A or is it B? Neither. But Jesus responds in those words that surely you've heard sermons after sermons on. The time is coming and now is when they that worship God must worship him in spirit and in truth. Why? Because God is spirit. What the woman is concerned about is, where's the right place? Jerusalem or Gerizim? What's the right time? Jewish or Samaritan Sabbath? What's the right way to worship God? The Samaritans only had 5 books in their Old Testament. The Jews had the 39 that we have. So what's the right place? What's the right time? What's the right way to worship God? And Jesus says, if you do that, if it's your concept, if you think God is in a building to be worshipped at a time in a prescribed form, then you have essentially conceived of God as material like everything else in creation. He can only be found in one place, not another. He's in Gerizim or Jerusalem or Gerizim, but not in both. But God is spirit. He's everywhere. If you conceive that you can only find God in that place at a certain time, then you've located him in time, where God is spirit. He's everywhere all the time. And God must be worshipped according to 5 books or 39 books or millions of books. You still conceive God as material, and not what John is trying to conceive for us in the Christian story, that God is spirit and he must be worshipped accordingly. So if I can add a pastoral preaching note at this point, true worship for Christians then is any time, any place, any way, everything we do. Because God is spirit. We go to church on a Sunday, we go to a building, we follow an order of service, not because we conceive that this is the place to worship God and not this, but because we realise that that's the tip of the iceberg of a lifestyle of worship. We worship God all the time, everywhere we are, in everything we do, and then we come together to celebrate that on a Sunday or whenever. Okay, away from preaching. So what we've got then is the second sign. The second sign in the new age of Messiah, the age of wine. There's a new temple. The place where we find God, and the place I find God as a Christian, is where the resurrected Christ is, where the Spirit is. And where the Spirit is in my daily life, pervading everything I do, but it's also in the collection of people that I meet together with on a Sunday and so on. So true worship is a lifestyle, not an act. Sign 5, in chapter 7 and 8, the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Tabernacles was this once-a-year event where the Jews remembered how God had brought them through the wilderness experience. They lived out away from their homes in little makeshift booths, little lean-tos, and remembered how God had brought them through the desert for 40 years. The Feast of Tabernacles had 2 great final acts in this week-long ceremony. The first one was the water ceremony. On the last day, the great day of the feast, the priests' sons would go down to the pool of Siloam and gather water. They would bring it up to the Jerusalem temple, and they would pour the water over the altar as a remembrance of what God had done in the wilderness to provide water for them. And it was the hope that one day again, when Messiah comes, when he ushers us into the age of Messiah, the age to come, the age of wine, that he will again sustain us miraculously, typified by the pouring of the water out onto the altar by the next generation, the priest's sons. The sad point, of course, was that they were doing it again and again and again every time they did it. It was a great feast, lovely week celebrations, but very sad on the last day of the feast when they poured out the water to realise that we're doing it again, which means that Messiah hasn't come yet. We still live in hope that one day he will come. The last day, the great day of the feast, the water ceremony. And Jesus stands up in 7:37 and he says, "Whosoever is thirsty, let him come unto me and drink, for out of his innermost beings will flow rivers of living water." This is on the Feast of Tabernacles. The feast, when they're celebrating what God had done for them and looking for hoping in the future. And these Christians to whom John writes, been kicked out of the synagogue, told they can't attend the Feast of Tabernacles, concerned now that they can't worship God at this great feast. And John writes and he says, don't worry about it. You don't have to go to the feast in Jerusalem. You understand as Christians that we're in the new age of wine. We worship God in a new temple and we keep new feasts. The feast has been fulfilled in Jesus, who in his coming has restored to us the sustenance that we need in our daily walk with God, that's typified by the outpouring of water. Jesus supplies it all by his Spirit. The final act on this week-long ceremony was called the fire, the light ceremony. In the light ceremony, the week-long festival the temple was surrounded on its high walls with candelabra. These candelabra were kept lit for the whole week. Again, the priest's sons, denoting that the next generation will continue the story of God's activity in Israel's life. They would make wicks for the candelabra out of the priest's clothing for the former 12 years. They would weave them into a plait, and they would come down from the candelabra into the vats of oil that the priest's sons would keep filled for the whole week. These candelabra would light the temple area for the week. The final act after this week-long ceremony that marked the end of the Feast of Tabernacles was when this great candelabra were extinguished in the light ceremony. It was the saddest point of the whole week. The whole week had been a fantastic time. Lots of getting back with your friends and relatives, meeting together, having a wonderful time of reflecting on God's glory in the past and the hope of an incredible future to come. But the most devastating part was when everything went black, when they extinguished the candelabra, because it meant the feast had come to an end and their hope of Messiah coming has got to wait still further, maybe another year when they meet again at the Feast of Tabernacles. And so it was a really sad part of the week. Now I have to use a bit of sacred imagination here, I suppose, but in John 8:12, I can imagine that this high point of the ceremony, a deep hush has fallen over the people. Great sadness because the week-long festival has come to an end. Messiah has not yet appeared. And Jesus stands up on the last day, the great day of the feast, in 8:12, and he says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever comes to me shall not live in darkness." And again, I can imagine, why does John choose this and put it in his gospel? Because he's writing to a bunch of Christians recently kicked out of the synagogue in Ephesus, challenged as to whether Jesus is true Messiah. And John records from all the things that Jesus did and said, some of the things to put into his book, most notably the things that point to Jesus being Messiah, the signs of John's gospel. And he includes this one to say, you don't any longer need to go to these great feasts of Israel, so don't worry when they exclude you. Don't worry when they kick you out. Don't worry when they say to you, you can't be God's people because you can't attend the feasts that God has mandated for us as the people of God to attend. You don't have to celebrate the feast because it's celebrated for you in the coming of Messiah Jesus, who's launched us into the age of wine, given us a new temple, and now we can celebrate new feasts in Jesus, the final fulfillment of all that the Old Testament pointed to. John's Gospel. What a fantastic story, completion of the Old Testament that John gives us. Let me do one more. In the Feast of Dedication in chapter 10, the Feast of Dedication was a once a year feast where they celebrated what we talked about in session 1. They celebrated the Judas Maccabean episode. They celebrated the Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah, the dedication of the temple after that 3-year guerrilla warfare that Judas Maccabeus had led to overthrow the Syrian invasion that was instituted by Antiochus Epiphanes, offering on the altar to Zeus built in the holy place a pig in celebration of his victory over Israel. And 3 years later, the dedication of the temple after that successful guerrilla warfare marked an incredibly important event in Israel's history. At that feast, they read the books. They read certain scriptures. One of which was to suggest that the reason that Antiochus was able to come in so easily and destroy Jerusalem and set up a desecrating sacrilege in the holy place was because the leaders of Israel at that time were false shepherds. This is the words that were used at this great feast. They were false shepherds. They were hirelings who fled at the sight of an advancing animal, fox or wolf or whatever. And so what they would do is read that reminder. The reason that Antiochus was able to come in so easily is because we had false shepherds. And their hope was that God would give them good shepherds that would lead his people, that we would have hearing voices to hear the good shepherd. Their idea of a good shepherd was one, hear these words, that would lay down his life for the sheep. Now here again we have a feast of dedication, a Jewish feast, that the people who've just kicked out the Christians from the synagogue in AD 95 in Ephesus, and the Christians are now concerned that maybe they're following the wrong Messiah, we can't go to the Feast of Dedication, and therefore we may not be acceptable to God. And John writes this into his Gospel in chapter 10, and we hear these words of Jesus, I am the good shepherd. I lay down my life for the sheep. In other words, all that the Feast of Dedication look forward to, John tells us has been completed in Jesus. We're in the new age of God's relationship with God, the age of wine. We have a new temple, the resurrected Christ present by his Spirit, in which we can offer true worship. We go to the true feasts, the Feast of Tabernacles with Jesus, the light and the water ceremony. We go to the Feast of Dedication when we remember that Jesus is the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. John's Gospel, we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke. John's Gospel is given to us in the form of a Greek drama. In a drama, I went to see The Pirates of Penzance a number of years ago. And when I walked into the theatre, they gave me a program. The program told me the basic character sketch and the simple plot that I was to see when the program commenced. This program, John 1 to 18, is the program. It gives you a character sketch. You know who the main characters are. In the beginning was the Word was with God. There was a man sent from God, his name was John, etc. It gives you a basic character sketch. It gives you a basic plot. The basic plot of John's Gospel is in the centre point of the prologue of John 1 to 18, at verses 11, 12 and 13. And here's the basic plot of John's Gospel. He, Jesus, the main character, the Word, came to his own people, the Jews, but they rejected him. But as many as received him, to as many as believed in him, to them he gave the right, the authority, to become the children of God. Children not born of bloods, literally, in the Greek, not born of the flesh or of a husband's will, but of God, born of God. Now notice then the basic plot is that there will be a new people of God. No longer is it of bloods. A Jewish worldview is you can't be the people of God unless you can trace your lineage back in good Jewish genealogical style. You can't be the people of God. And John's Gospel, of course, is written to people who probably come out of the synagogue, so it's not only Jews, but it's God-fearers and proselytes, Gentiles, and they are being challenged that they're following the wrong Messiah, and they couldn't be Messiah's people anyway because they're not Jewish. And John's writing his Gospel, and he's trying to say, yes, you are the people of God. And so in the prologue, it points to who the people of God are then. No longer born of bloods, no longer born of the flesh, no longer born of a husband's will, but born of God. Came to his own people, the Jews, they rejected him. But to as many as received him, to as many as believed in him, to them he gave the authority to become the children of God. In the first 4 chapters of John's Gospel, he illustrates for us who those to as many as believed, to as many as received him are. He samples them for us. For example, in the end of chapter 1 and chapter 2, the first people who believe Jesus, and therefore are given authority to become the children of God, who are now in the new age of Messiah, the age of wine, who can worship in the new temple, the resurrected Christ by his Spirit, and offer true worship because God is Spirit, who celebrate the true feasts. In chapters 1 and 2, it's Jews. Nathaniel, Peter, Andrew. But in John's agenda, they are the children of God not because they are born of the flesh, not because they are born of bloods, the right genealogy, not because they're born of a husband's will, but they're born of God. Why? Because they believe or receive Jesus, the true Messiah. In chapter 4, we've already made mention, we come to the woman at the well. And we're told in chapter 4 that she believed, so much so that she goes into the village and says, come, let me introduce you to a man who told me all that I ever did. And it says the whole town came out and they believed. They received Jesus. John 1, 11 and 12, to as many as received, to many as believed, he gave them the authority to become children of God. The Samaritans believe, receive, they get the authority to become children of God. They can be the new people of God. But notice what John's done for us brilliantly. You have Jews who are the new people of God. You have Samaritans, but not only Samaritans, but a Samaritan woman. If a Samaritan is on the outside of who can be the people of God in the Jewish way of thinking, then a Jewish Samaritan of doubtful reputation would be the most impossible of being in the people of God. And yet John shows us that she's included as the people of God. Right at the end of chapter 4, you get Jesus healing a nobleman's son. The word nobleman, basilikos, means one who is in the service of the Gentile king. He's a Gentile. Here's a Gentile then at the end of chapter 4, where John records for us another sign, the healing of this nobleman's son, and it says he believed, he received Jesus. In other words, here's another one who can be given the authority to become the children of God because he believes, receives Jesus. So at the end of chapter 4, we know who it is that when Jesus came to his own Jews and they rejected him, but to as many as received him, to many as believed him, he gave the right to become the children of God. We know who they are. They can be Jews, they can be Gentiles, they can be Samaritans, they can be men, they can be women, they can be of any age, because it says of the Basilikos that he and his whole household, including the little boy who's just been healed, believe, receive Jesus, and therefore are constituted as the children of God. So what's John's story in the marketplace of stories? It's this, that with the coming of true Messiah, we've launched into the age of wine, the age of restored relationship with God. In this new age of wine, there is a new people. The new people are no longer an ethnic, geographically, politically centred people, but it's of any race, of any age, and of any gender, who can come in this new age of wine to the new temple, the resurrected Christ present by his Spirit, and can offer new worship according to what God really is, Spirit. They can celebrate the new feasts that brought to fulfilment in Jesus, the true Messiah. This is the Christian account of how the Old Testament ends. This is the Christian alternative to the marketplace of stories. This is the competing way of describing things the way they are to the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sicarii. This is not to say the Roman and Greco world and their stories. This is how John, in 60 years reflection, wants to paint the picture for us of what it is to understand the Christian worldview, what it is to understand Jesus, so that he can write in John 20 verse 30 and 31, many, many other things. John 21, 25, a whole world full did Jesus do in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. But these ones are, the ones that John records, in order that you may continue to believe that Jesus is Messiah, Son of God. Because only in believing that Jesus is Messiah, Son of God, will you have life in his name. Life in his name, right relationship with God. I give you the Christian story. Bless you.